This week's episode of the Religious Studies Project is again sponsored by Equinox Publishing. And this week we're featuring the book Identity Politics and the Study of Islam, Current Dilemmas in the Study of Religions, a very RSP book, and that's edited by our pal Matt Sheedy of the University of Manitoba. I'm certainly interested in reading that, and if you are, you can get a 25% discount off the book using the code RELIGION if you order at equinoxpub.com. That's equinoxpub.com. Use the code RELIGION for 25% off. Now, let's have the show.
Welcome, dear listeners. This is Chris Cotter of the Religious Studies Project, sitting in Oslo, wondering where David is. Where are you, David? I can't see you.
I'm sitting in my living room in Edinburgh, as usual. And welcome, listeners, wherever you may be, to the Religious Studies Project. This week, we have another episode recorded by Chris at the EASR, and this time it's on representations of religious studies in popular culture with Brian Collins and Kristen Tobey. We talked a little bit about this last week, so without further ado, let's pass over and find out who represents us.
Many of our discussions at the Religious Studies Project focus upon the complex intersections between religion, whatever that is, and popular culture. And justifiably so. Indeed, our good friend and colleague Vivian Asimov of Durham University has been producing a very interesting religion and popular culture podcast for a while now. But what about religious studies and the people who do it in popular culture? When I initially thought about this, I could certainly come up with a list of academics and bookish people who are somewhat problematically and wildly inaccurately portrayed in popular culture, from archaeology's Indiana Jones and paleontology's Ross Geller to archivists Rupert Giles or linguistics Louise Banks. But I had to admit, I struggled to come up with many examples of the study of religion as we here at the Religious Studies Project know it. Luckily, today's guests have the question much more firmly in focus, given that, as they argue, popular cultural representations are much more likely to shape public perceptions about what the study of religion is and who does it than either direct experience in the classroom or statistics about graduation rates and job placements. We hope that you will agree that we should try to understand what these perceptions are. So joining me today to discuss this fascinating and important topic are Professors Brian Collins and Kristen Tobey. So first off, Brian, Kristen, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I'll just say a little bit about who you are. Brian Collins is Associate Professor and the Doctors Ram and Sushia Gawande Chair in Indian Religion and Philosophy at Ohio University. Is the author of The Head Beneath the Altar, Hindu Mythology and the Critique of Sacrifice, and various essays on Hinduism and the Study of Religion. And his second book, The Other Rama, Matricide and Varnacide in the Mythology of Parasurama, apologies for the pronunciation, is forthcoming from SUNY Press. And Kristen Tobey is Assistant Professor of Religion and Social Sciences at John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio, and her research treats religious identity formation and communication in the contemporary United States. And she's the author of Plowshares, Protest, Performance, and Religious Identity in the Nuclear Age. So that's where you're coming from. How did you get interested then in this question of the representation of the study of religion in popular culture? You know, it doesn't necessarily sound like your main research focus. So how did we get into that?
Well, should I answer this one, Kristen? I think I started this
first.
project, and I asked Kristen to join me, and she graciously did. And together we worked on the project. But it started out because, and I think both of us had an idea at some point. We study religion, and we have to eventually tell people that we study religion, and then see what they think we do. Very infrequently does someone have an actual idea of what the study of religion at a university entails. You know, I teach classes in Hinduism and Buddhism, and if you take both classes, students typically ask, in the second class, why are you teaching this? I thought you were a Hindu. Or why are you teaching this? I thought you were a Buddhist, because I'm teaching those classes. So the idea of studying religion as an academic subject is a mystery to most people. And I said, well, if they don't know, what do they know and where do they get the information? So I started, I watch a lot of movies and TV, and I consume a lot of junk culture. So I saw a few people here and there who seemed to be basically doing what I do, but not in a way that I recognized. And so I wanted to cast a wide net and see what impressions were out there.
Yeah, I face the same thing, less from my students because I teach at a Catholic school, so they're familiar with religion teachers, although not quite the same way I tend to do it. But I face this a lot with my research subjects who are very suspicious of the idea of someone studying religion academically because the examples that they see, as Brian says, in pop culture are so very strange. So when Brian asked me to join this project, I was really excited for that reason, and also because my research usually deals with how religious people either present themselves or are presented. So to think about another piece of that, as you said, Chris, well, how is the field presented? How are the people who do it presented? That was very interesting to me in thinking about questions of identity.
Wonderful. I should have said in the introduction, of course, that part of the reason we're having this conversation is that the two of you have just published an article, I say just, June 2018, in Religious Studies Review, which is called From Middlemarch to the Da Vinci Code, Portrayals of Religious Studies in Popular Culture. So that will give a hint to the listeners of where we might be going with our in-depth examples here. Yeah, how did you go about even finding your case study?
Well, for me, I did have to think about that. That's a methodological question that sort of we had to ask at the very beginning. And I compiled a list. I said, Indiana Jones sort of reminds me of a person who does religion, but he's clearly identified as an archaeologist. So I wanted to find people that weren't clearly identified as archaeologists or classicists or anthropologists. There's a different article, 2 articles by anthropologists in literature and movies that we cite in our article, but seem to be studying something like what we do. So I eliminated people like parapsychologists and clearly identified historians. So there was that sort of middle ground. Robert Langdon is a religious symbologist, which is a totally made-up profession at a real university, whereas Casaubon from Middlemarch, the other big example that we treat, is, what is he identified as, Kristen?
He's identified as a scholar, but he's very clearly engaged in work that it would be recognizable for a historian of religions, very much in the mold of somebody from that era. So it's actually in many ways a pretty accurate depiction. But as far as garnering the case studies and garnering the examples, I remember, Brian, was it years ago maybe, or do I just have a skewed chronology on this, that you sent around an email to maybe half a dozen people just saying, hey, I'm thinking about this. What examples can you think of? And one thing that was really striking to me is that as those emails came back to you, most of them were from horror movies, right? The vast majority of these characters appear in scary movies, doing scary things, summoning demons, whatever else. So as far as characters that we would actually recognize as doing the work that we do, Casaubon is one of very few examples.
Yeah, that's what I did. I mean, I crowdsourced the research. It's easier to get someone else to do the research for you, I find. And so I came up with a list, and then I said, basically like these people, anybody else you can think of. Again, it's not identified clearly as something else. And so I did get a long list. There were comic books on there. There were podcasts on there. There were movies, mostly horror movies on there. There were a few novels on there. And some of the ones I ended up having to eliminate because they were the sort of archivists. So there were a lot of the archivists, like the Giles from Buffy that you talk about. And that was a limit case for me. I didn't know whether to include those or not, but I feel like they're somewhere in the mix, but for our article, we didn't discuss them. The archivist is kind of has a family resemblance to the archetype of the religious studies person, but we ended up leaving them out because they're, if you ask who they are, somebody can tell you that they're an archivist, they're not a religionist. But the case is that nobody is identified as a historian of religion or a religionist. Partly that's our fault. We have no easily identifiable, transferable job title from university to university, nor even a place at any university that can consistently be found. So that was just that way in the representations too. We had to kind of make decisions along the way and narrow it down.
Yeah, with the very notable exception, and tell me if I'm getting ahead of things here, of Emily Dumont in Black Tapes, right? I think she's one of just a handful, maybe 3 or 4, who was actually introduced as a professor of religious studies. then it turns out what she does is not really like what professors of religious studies do at all, but she's one of few who actually gets that label attached to her.
Excellent. Well, we can get to that. So yeah, the Black Tapes is a podcast that I unfortunately had never heard of when I read your article, but you do a good job of discussing it, so it'd be quite good for us on the Religious Studies Project podcast to discuss that. But I'll just also mention that I put out on Twitter last week that we were doing this podcast, and we got a couple of responses. I asked what were your personal favorites and bugbears. So Richard Newton at the University of Alabama said that he likes Professor Jamal in Muslim, that's Moozlum, said that there was an emphasis on good questions over simple answers, imbrication of race and religion, an examination of the insider-outsider problem. And then another character that you discuss is in the Hulu series, The Path. What came back, we had Tyler Tully saying that he really enjoyed The Path on Hulu and their inclusion of the religious studies scholar, particularly their treatment of emerging religious traditions. But then Joel Bordeaux said the religion professor on The Path is probably the worst he's ever seen. Invited as a guest to a class and openly deriding their tradition, conducting secret sexual relationships with research subjects, deliberately intervening in communities he's studying, and so on. So you might want to respond to some of that, and then maybe let's tell us about Emily Dumont.
Well, I think, Emily Dumont is interesting. I do want to talk about Jackson Neal from The Path, actually. It's one of the best examples, and it came very late in this project, which was, I was watching the show, I said, now I have to go back and rewrite a large part of this, and I did. But Emily Dumont, so the Black Tapes is it's a podcast. It's sort of like the X-Files. It's told in the story, in the style of a true crime sort of serial type podcast where they're investigating supposedly true occurrences and the characters are meant to be real people. So it blurs the line between fiction and reality in journalism. But they interview people, and they interview a religious studies scholar named Emily Dumont. I do get mixed up. There's a lot of these. She is specifically interested in demonology, right? She's described as very informally dressed, sort of like she's described her as an overgrown high school freshman with a Ramones t-shirt and a funky haircut, and sort of irreverent, and also speaking about chemtrails, which is a strange conspiracy theory about air travel or something. I don't really understand it, but it was bizarre X-Files type stuff, and it was put in the mouth of a religious studies professor. Elsewhere on that same podcast, there's a different religious studies professor who openly derides her as a crank, even though she's in a university and he's not, who takes a really hard-nosed scientific, some would say a kind of a reductivist view of religion, and that his job is to disprove miracles, a pretty common theme, that the job is either to disprove religion or to become leader of a religion. But in the case of Emily Dumont, she's marginalized as someone who's sort of a joke, and that was a little disconcerting. And I think that a podcast like that, you're likely to have people who went to college, audience who went to college, and somewhere along the way had a class. So I feel like this person seems to me that was drawn from some experience of some professor, some wacky religious studies professor. That was my read on it. What did you think, Kristen?
I think that's possible, but I also think that podcast is doing something really odd in that it's conflating paranormal studies, paranormal activity with religion in a wholesale, non-nuanced way. Because we do have this Emily Dumont character who's very childlike, who's very gullible, who represents one possibility, right? The person who's involved in religious studies and the paranormal because of naivete, let's say. But then there's the other character, Richard Strand, who is very skeptical, very reductive. He's not a religious studies professor, but he was a religious studies major, we are told. So we have these two extremes, both attached to the field of religious studies. But then, and I should say, I only managed to listen to the first half dozen or so episodes before it became too scary for me. But they were interesting, and then it was too scary and I couldn't continue. But throughout those first few episodes, we get other characters being brought in who are also sort of oddly attached to religion. For example, one character who is described as being, and I'm pretty much quoting here, what theologians would call a biblical demonologist. As far as I know, there is no such thing as biblical demonology, though I'm not a theologian, so maybe there is, and I just don't know. Maybe, but that's what I mean when I say that it's as though the paranormal and religious studies are just completely layered on top of one another in this show, or podcast rather, in some ways that are kind of interesting, in some ways that are really bizarre, and there doesn't really seem to be any explanation, at least in the first half dozen episodes, of why that's the case or how those particular choices are being made. So yes, maybe there's something very specific going on in that one of the creators had a professor that Dumont is, modeled upon, but maybe there's something else happening, which is just that it's a podcast dealing with sort of odd supernatural paranormal stuff, and there's nowhere else that it makes sense to house that other than religious studies.
I mean, it's odd because it would have been 10 years ago a parapsychologist. I mean, they used to have those in movies all the time, the people that investigated hauntings and psychic phenomena and stuff. I mean, the Ghostbusters are
Ghostbusters, sure.
They're in a parapsychology lab. They're doing Zener cards. So what happened to that, I don't know. But why it became religion here. But nothing recognizable as religion is ever studied. Now, that said, I was inspired to teach a class on religion and the paranormal, and it became the most popular class that I teach because of that. I'm seeing these movies. And so
absolutely,
that's good, I guess. And some people do write about it. We mentioned that in the article, too. There's a new sort of newish wave of books dealing with religious experience and paranormal from different angles, and Taves, Jeff Kripal from really different points of view.
Yep.
So there is some of that, but I don't think anybody knew that as they're making these characters, right? I think that's coincidental or part of a larger zeitgeist.
Exactly. I'm just keen that we keep pressing on because I do want to get Jackson Neal, but we've got to get to the Da Vinci Code and everything before. So maybe quickly. So in your article, I think you were saying that Jackson Neal, although he may not be the most morally upright of scholars in that sense, actually what he's doing perhaps maybe quite closely resembles what we would consider the study of religion.
Well, he's an Americanist just like Kristen, which is why I pointed him out to her very early on. I mean, he's doing a kind of ethnography, which is what she does. But what he does that she doesn't do, as far as I know, is get on major talk shows advertising his book.
No, just this. This is my 15 minutes of fame right here.
But then he has a sexual relationship with his informant. He inserts himself in the life of this religious studies movement, which is uniformly new religious movement, which is uniformly referred to as a cult throughout the TV series. All sorts of things that seems like he would have had to go through IRB to do, but had no problem doing them. He's eventually sort of discredited and they turn against him, but it's so realistic that it almost feels like this is something that people would believe represents the study of religion in the academy. And it does, and this is in the sense that we do that kind of work. We do talk to people about their experiences, but what we don't do is try and undermine some tradition with an expose.
And I think another thing that's important about that character is that one of the tropes we identified in a lot of these representations is a thread of hypocrisy. So yeah, maybe he's a good scholar, maybe he's doing actual scholarly work that resembles what an Americanist and an ethnographer might do, but then he's got this potentially sort of shady sexual stuff going on. I am hard pressed to think of a depiction of, say, I don't know, a math professor, right, where there is a plot that has to do with shady sexual behavior, whereas it comes up over and over and over again in these religious studies characters, as though people using these characters are doing it in order to sort of identify a hypocrisy that's inherent to studying religion.
Which would scan with my intuition anyway.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception.
But we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help, either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
Just so that we can absolutely get to it, you discussed then how a lot of these characters can sometimes end up in a sort of pathetic, heroic spectrum. You've got your the sort of nerdy, weedy scholar working away, pale-faced and not much interest in real life. And then you've got the Indiana Joneses running around there, dashing, wonderful knowledge. And so you set up this comparison really well in the article between the Reverend Casaubon from George Eliot's Middlemarch, and then Robert Langdon from Dan Brown's books, Angels and Demons, Da Vinci Code, and so on. I'm afraid it's been over a decade since I read Middlemarch, but it was nice engaging with it again through your article. Would you maybe just, for the next 5 minutes or so, brief introduction to these two characters and maybe sort of set them up against each other and, what the different models of the study of religion?
Yeah, I'll start with Casaubon, who appears first in, of course, George Eliot's Middlemarch in the 19th century. He is sort of the quintessential example of a dry, dusty, pedantic scholar who only cares about his books. As I mentioned earlier, he is doing work that's very recognizable as history of religions. He's trying to compile sort of a massive comparative mythology. We learn later on in the book that he doesn't actually have the language skills to do this, that he will never finish this sort of fruitless project. And most of the characters, ultimately pretty much all of the characters in the novel, think that he's ridiculous and think that he's so sort of intellectually obsessed that he's out of touch with real life. It compromises his virility. He doesn't deserve the love of the beautiful protagonist, so on and so forth. So he is pretty much a paradigmatic example of intellectual obsession that basically ruins everything else about him. And something interesting we noticed as we were thinking about his character is that even in more recent and contemporary updates, where other characters are treated somewhat differently and more sympathetically, Casaubon never is. So, for example, there's a very recent YouTube series that is updating Middlemarch. It's, young, attractive students on a college campus, and many of them are socially awkward in some way, but still endearing. Whereas Casaubon, who is now in this rendering a graduate student working on some completely abstruse dissertation topic that would probably fit in philosophy of religion, for example, is still a really unpleasant character. There's still this linkage between his intellectual obsession and unpleasantness. No one likes him. He is unlikable because he is sort of a sham scholar, let's say. That is, he's obsessed with his intellectual project, but he doesn't really have the skills to do it successfully. So weak, pathetic, unlikable, all of these adjectives continue to attach to him even in contemporary updates.
Yeah, and on a surface level, your gut reaction is that that's quite different to the character in Dan Brown's work, who we see portrayed on film by Tom Hanks, who's, I don't know, America's, if not the world's most loved actor in some ways. That's quite a different character, but not so different, I believe.
Right. I mean, it's hard to find somebody who doesn't like Tom Hanks. I mean, he's like the Jimmy Stewart of our generation. He's much beloved, and he plays this guy. But one thing that's interesting about him that's the same, there's a lot about him that's different, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's the sexual aspect. I mean, I think that Casaubon is really a neutered character, right? He has no sexual drive, no sexual energy associated with him. He's seen as a sort of a dried up old husk of a person. Whereas Langdon has a different kind of asceticism in that, Dan Brown uses the term good, clean fun. Like it's all about good, clean fun, which means that Indiana Jones has a different female love interest in every movie, that they have a will, they won't, they, and of course they will. But in all of the movies based on the Da Vinci Code books, I mean, the books about Robert Langdon, his female lead is not in any kind of a romantic relationship. They don't even have a handshake. It's the most chaste heroine relationship one can possibly imagine. In the first book, she's the descendant of Jesus Christ, which is a meaningless thing anyway to think about 2,000 years of generational history. But it's someone who you can't imagine having sex with someone on a movie or on screen, right?
Yeah.
He's also a very sort of consciously non-sexual, de-eroticized character, unlike, the ones we talked about before. But what he does is really instructive. I mean, I think that nobody has done more to get the study of religion in the public consciousness than Dan Brown. The Catholic reaction to those books, this sort of revival of interest in conspiracy theories about the Illuminati and what have you. I mean, never really went away, but it certainly got more. And that was what became the shorthand for study of religion, is studying the secret conspiracies behind all the fakeness of religion. And that's what he does. But everything he says about religion is nonsense. And we also learn that he's not even the person who teaches religious studies. That's somebody else at Harvard who we never meet. But he has this particularly narrow focus on religious symbology without any explanation of what a symbol is, and mistaking symbols, ciphers, and codes for each other. It's a very thinly researched book, right? I mean, there's a lot of work on the conspiracies, but as far as what he's doing, what we see him doing in classrooms, what we see him talking about, what passes in his dialogue as profound knowledge. I mean, the Feast of Sol Invictus has something to do with Christmas and blows everybody's mind. Is really speaks to the depth of ignorance about the study of religion, which is, I think, an indictment, really, for me anyway. If this just goes over without a ripple, then how have we not established in any meaningful way what we do in the classroom, what we do in our books?
Indeed, yeah. And someone else pointed out that one of the biggest errors, perhaps, in the portrayal is the completely full lecture hall that he's teaching to, of attentive students.
The bottomless budget that he has.
So, I mean, we could go into in depth on these characters, and obviously we direct the listeners to your article, which we'll link to from the podcast page to get really into the analysis of them. But towards the end of the article, you ask, through this comparison exercise, like, what kind of picture have you formed of the fictional religious studies scholar? And then also about what emerges about religion as an object of study. So perhaps using the examples that we've discussed thus far, could you tell us a little bit about what we can say about the generic fictional religious studies scholar in a nutshell, and maybe how religion's conceived?
Well, the one thing that's interesting about the Robert Langdon character is that he's the only one that gives us a real definition of what religion is as an object of study. Now, it doesn't. I'll just quote from the book. The book is actually it's in The Lost Symbol, which is a later book in the series, and he says to his class, this is we've cited in the article too. So tell me, what are the 3 prerequisites for an ideology to be considered a religion? A, B, C, one woman offered. Assure, believe, convert. Correct, Langdon said. Religions assure salvation. Religions believe in a precise theology. And religions convert non-believers. It's a self-evident to him and to everyone else in the class rote definition of religion. It's not very useful to me. It has nothing to do with symbols, interestingly, which to him is the foundation of the study of religion as he does it. But it does give you a very pat definition of what religion is. And assure, believe, and convert are all sort of these verbs that imply control over a crowd, over a group, over minds. It's a very cynical and of course, one-dimensional, or I guess three-dimensional technically, but thin definition of religion, and it's the only one we really get. The question of what religion is never comes up for anybody, which is, in considering the amount of ink that we've spilled over the last 50 years trying to figure out what that is, that does not translate into the representations as we have them.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that all we have is this very thin, superficial, reductive definition, which might well be a definition that works well for some religion scholars. I find it a bit odd, but that's just me. Because it seems to me that what religious studies does best is sort of the opposite of the thin and superficial, right? And nowhere in this examination of characters do we see anyone who's doing sort of the thick work of religious studies, right? So, well, what is religion? Assure, believe, control. Is that what it was? Something like that. So then what is religious studies? As Brian says, it's this very simplistic endeavor that has to do with recognizing a very simplistic dynamic at play. In other words, in these depictions, we don't see religious studies scholarship as being about critical empathy. We don't see it as being about rigorous analysis, right? We don't see it as being about robust comparison, which to my mind are the things that it does best and the things that it can help students to do best. So we get not only a wild misrepresentation of what religion is, that is, it's always about, coerced conversion and that sort of thing. It's always about shadowy mystery and espionage. But we also get, I think, very unfair misrepresentation of what religious studies is doing, and by that same token, is not doing.
Or the flip side of what you're saying there, the Casaubon character there, we would have religious studies being the sort of dry study of texts and the very esoteric search for some sort of higher knowledge that is sort of beyond relevance to the social world. So it's either something that's a sort of irrelevant, bookish, and not of interest, or something that's sort of swashbuckling and uncovering conspiracies and releasing people from coercive control, and exactly. Neither of which are very accurate depictions of what any of us do.
Or ghost hunting. Sometimes it's about ghost hunting, don't forget. But yes, included in none of those things is there the sort of very important skills that religious studies, when done well, actually can and should inculcate.
Well, what you also find is Casaubon is a textual scholar, a clear-cut textual scholar, and I would expected that to sort of hold through time, but increasingly they're not textual scholars, even though we think that's what we all are, and that's sort of something to overcome. I mean, that's kind of the critique, too text-based, whatever. But mostly they're going into cults, or they are talking to believers, and usually believers who are radical in some way. And so they tend to be out in the field looking at miraculous events and bizarre beliefs, as they sort of characterize them, more than they are reading books or comparing. Comparing is the one thing that's almost never done, except for with Langdon, and it's a very weird kind of comparison. But outside of him, there is almost no comparison. It's just studying the one thing that's their dissertation topic, that's their tenure, that's going to fill up their tenure portfolio, or that's usually their personal dark obsession that drives them to becoming serial killers often.
So we are over time here, which is fine because we're going to get to wrapping up. But as I would say, listeners, do check out the article where you can hear a lot of this stuff that we're just skimming over in a lot more detail. But my final two questions I wanted to throw out would be, what can we do about these portrayals? So it's a similar thing with the media, for example. A lot of my colleagues and I are always moaning about, the media never really get things right about religion. It's terrible, it's awful. But I never really hear solutions. What can we do about the portrayal of religion in the media? So what potentially could we do about the portrayal of religious studies in, here, popular culture or beyond? Any suggestions based upon your thinking about this?
I'll try this one. Public scholarship could be an important mitigation here. The extent to which actual religious studies scholars are doing the actual work of religious studies in a way that can be seen by the public, that could be one mitigating force against these sort of wild misrepresentations that we have.
mean, I feel like that it starts with students. I mean, we come into contact with a lot of students over the course of our careers, and it's not just religious studies. I think they're often don't ever figure out what any of the faculty members do most of the time because we don't talk about it ever. It's sort of opaque for some reason. So I think talking to students about our work, about our interests, about how we got interested in it, I think it's useful. I think it's helpful. I think it clarifies things. It makes our position clear. And we can do that on a small level more. I mean, I think we could everybody in the academy better engage with their students about who they are and what they do and how they're compensated, et cetera. But I think we could especially do that. Now, the interesting thing is, over the time I was writing this article, we had the affair of Reza Aslan here in the States, who had a rise as the first real rise to power, rise to prominence, as the first real public intellectual in religious studies, only to be fired pretty quickly for making a comment on Twitter about President Trump after a few episodes of his show, Believer, which was widely derided by scholars of religion, as was his book about Jesus. What's it called? Zealot. So here we have a missed opportunity to have a public intellectual present, model this kind of work. But that doesn't mean that has to be the last time we try that. I think that maybe that's the place to start. A plot where you save the Pope from a radical Catholic assassin is going to be more interesting than a plot where you translate a text. But it doesn't have to be about plot. It can be about the stuff that they used to do on the BBC, where they had long-running, long-form sort of shows to educate the public in a way that is also engaging. I think that can be done again.
Yeah. And, maybe if you're burning the midnight oil, we could all be, writing those novels, writing those screenplays that we all wish we were seeing. Is this it for you with this project then, or do you have plans for future research, future publications? What's next for you?
I think Chris is writing the screenplay based on the article.
That's right. Look for the screenplay. Just kidding. Not really. No, I am developing a class on religion and pop culture, and a lot of this stuff sort of feeding the bill for that.
Well, I think that the natural next place to go would be a panel at the AAR, bring in more people to talk about it, and that seems to me like something. And I don't know if we need another article anytime soon, but I think that a bigger conversation, a public conversation about it at our annual meeting here would be helpful.
Excellent. And well, hopefully this podcast and your article will kick off a bit more of that conversation, and we can look forward to a future where the discipline, the field, is represented a bit more accurately. But for now, thank you so much, Brian and Kristen. It's been wonderful having you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
It was great to hear that interview again. And I should mention that the article that was forthcoming at the time of recording has now been published. So do check out the podcast page for details on that article. Wonderful to hear from them. And that interview was recorded using another tool called Collaborate. So we're really using a lot of different online recording tools, seeing which ones work better than Skype.
Indeed. Not that it would be hard to work better than Skype, in all honesty. It's
burn.
Yes. Well, it's fine for some things, but for recording quality. Anyway, so this is an experiment in us being able to record when we're not in the same town, which I suspect is going to happen increasingly often in the near future. But it's also something that we've been using to record some additional material for the Patreon patrons, if that's the right way of putting it.
Yeah. David had a conversation with Carol Cusack, for example, which went up fairly recently. We called that RSP, Are You My Data? And it was a sort of chance to ask Carol Cusack anything and everything under the sun. It was an excellent conversation. And then we also recorded the first episode of our RSP Discourse.
Indeed, that was a lot of fun with Brianne Fallon from Sydney as a guest, and we're intending to, as record at least one of these a month with a different guests. It won't always be me and Chris. We're hoping to get other editors involved in recording these. And the idea is that it's the RSP take on a kind of current affairs thing. So, how do you apply the critical approach that we use to how religion's being used in the media and in the news, and sometimes in the field as well. So go and check that out. If you haven't got access to it, if you're not a patron yet, it only costs $1 or £1 a month, and you won't even notice that. You can't even get into town for that much on the bus. So do consider signing up. You also get access to each of our episodes in a classroom edit, which means that it doesn't have this intro for a start. It doesn't have the adverts or the Patreon adverts or anything else. It's just goes straight to the interview, and that's designed for you to use in the classroom.
Absolutely. And don't fear, listeners, we aren't going to start charging for the RSP. Everything that we've continued to offer for free up till now, that's the regular podcast, the Ops Digest, all the features, the other things on our website, our social media feeds, that's all there, generously supported by our headline sponsors. But we thought there's some more interesting things that we can do, and we'd like to sort of give something back to those individuals and departments who've signed up for sort of special Patreon.
Absolutely. So it's a chance for us to try out some new formats as well, and it's just the next stage in where we're going.
Exactly. Next week, you're probably fed up hearing interviews from me. There's going to be quite a few of them over the coming weeks, but we've got an interview that Ross Downing recorded with us, with our Edinburgh colleague Anya Warren, about her research into the Dark Goddess. So it's called A Dark Goddess, an Interreligious Language for Feminine Spirituality. And that was recorded in Belfast at the ISASR BASR joint conference. And we're delighted that Ross recorded a few interviews for us. And sort of put his own spin onto it. So we're delighted to have something a bit different.
Absolutely. And we recorded some other interviews there, which will be coming up in later in the year, including our Christmas special. So, stay tuned as ever. We've got a lot of interviews recorded actually at this point, unusually so. So it's looking like it's going to be a great run. But anyway, we've whittled on enough. Until next week, Chris, let's try and do it together.
Right. Okay.
Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Yana Shirley. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio assistance from Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget, you can support the project using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or by donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals.